Good afternoon, everybody in Hawaii, and good evening to those of you in Denver. Thank you so much for inviting us to participate in your Tech Bites program. I think it's a great opportunity for us to link our programs and our student chapters. So today I was asked to talk about affective computing, and I'm going to do that. It's been part of my research for over a decade now. Right now I'm teaching a course called Human Dimension in Information Systems, and some students in my class are also here in the talk because we're actually in the class session right now. So we talk about obviously affective issues in a course that has to do with human dimension. What you see on the screen on the first slide are some of the elements that are used in affective computing research by people who do that sort of usability type of testing. Now, affect and computing have been related since computing began, and these are the emoticons. Have you ever felt like this when you're using a computer or like any of these things? Sometimes emoticons are used to rate experiences in using new technologies. And you can see that not all of them, in fact, many of them are not too happy because there is positive and negative affect using computers. So what is affect? That's one of the first things that people need to understand. And in order to understand it, we have to go to a whole different field of study, a whole different discipline, to psychology. And those who have studied affect for over a century in psychology have come up with sort of this kind of a division. It's not always agreed upon by everybody. This is a proposal, but typically affect is divided into states and traits. Traits are considered things that are long-lasting, things that don't change in a person. And states, however, are more dynamic and flexible, and they are typically related to situations. So when you're in a situation, it can make you have highly emotional experiences or not necessarily. And affective states are positive as well as negative. They include emotions, they include moods. There are basic and complex ones. It gets to be very complicated. It's a huge research area for many decades. And then in the upper right we have attitudes and preferences. What are those? You know, they're considered part of affect, but they may not be considered in part of the formal state trait model. Now the state trait model, it does exist and it does persist, but it is under attack, and there are other models and other approaches to this, which is not the topic of this discussion today, but just to let you know, it's not, there's not just one answer to what is affect. And I've looked at this aspect for many years, and I've done multiple literature reviews, and I've discovered that after many decades of multidisciplinary research in the fields of neuroscience and social psychology, education, computer science, information science, that's us, and cognitive science, when they study the role of emotion, they always find that it's integral to perception, to decision making, and to problem solving, and therefore to learning. And at the end of this presentation, there's about 4 slides of references that include materials from these various disciplines, so that you can see when you study affect, it really crosses many areas, and so it makes it even more complex to study. So since affect is really a mental experience that people have, how do we measure mental behavior like feelings and emotions and values and attitudes? There's basically 2 ways to do that. One way is through biological monitoring. And up in the upper left you see the Q sensor, and that's a little thing that you can wear on your wrist, and it keeps track of galvanic skin reaction, which is said to be an indicator of affect as it changes in a dynamic situation, like somebody using a new technology that they've never seen before, or trying to search for a really difficult search problem. So we can either strap on sensors to people, or we can ask people to tell us what their experiences are. And basically you really need a combination of the two to fully study this. Some researchers tend to focus on the biological side and others tend to focus on the user side, but a combination is probably the best because it's a complex issue to try to understand what people are going through when they're doing a task or when they're solving a problem, especially with technology. So I've described this dynamism as the emotional mental economy, and I have to admit that I discovered the mental economy not while I was studying search behavior or people using technologies. I discovered it while I was just studying people driving, and I was studying aggressive driving and road rage. It's another area that I've published and written a book on. So when I studied road rage, we discovered that people keep track of when they're getting ahead on the road and when they're losing ground on the road, and this is a mental thing. You know, so they feel better if they're passing a lot of cars and they feel worse if they're being passed by a lot of cars. And there are many other dynamics that I could go into about road rage, but that's a subject for another day. So the mental economy is something that is at work all the time. And so when you're using a new technology, for example, you get involved in preferring things about it or not, liking things about it or not, prioritizing use of it or prioritizing it low. You know, choosing things, being engaged about it, being excited in using it, you know, caring about using it, being irritated, feeling uncertain and feeling frustrated. All of these are affective issues, and they all arise while you're using technology. Of course, they arise in other things too, but we're focusing on affective computing today, so I'm restricting my comments to that domain. So when you ask the user how they're doing, you can use scales, bipolar continuum scales, from low to high, and usually they're 5-point, 7-point, or 10-point scales, that people can tell you how they feel at different points in technology use, and that's often done in usability studies. But if you look at the little diagram at the top, it's the plus-minus dynamism that we see. The little dots are floating up and down. Over time, you feel more positive or more negative while you're doing a task with a computer. So this is another way of getting information from the user by using these scales. You can also interview them. You can also have them provide descriptive explanations for the values that they choose on those scales. Now, affective computing itself really began when Rosalind Picard at MIT published her book called Affective Computing. She defined the field. It's not that things were not being done before that in affective computing, but she was able to just codify it with that expression, and then it really caught on and everybody realized, oh yes, that's what we've been doing all along. So now we know what we're doing, and I brought the book to class, but this is the cover of the book, and on the cover design, if you haven't seen this book before, what's running on the cover design are emoticons. It's all just strings of emoticons, and that's been a major way that people can communicate how they feel in a technological environment is by using emoticons. Now, people who are in affective computing, I mean computer scientists, I mean people who are in human-computer interaction on the computer science side, what they mean by affective computing is that they want computers to be able to recognize emotions, to be able to express emotions, and to be able to have emotions in a technical way of having emotions. And that's really their intention. It's not quite the same intention as people who work with users in libraries, for example, and study the affective side of computing. What we want is for people to have a better experience using our systems. And so we want our systems to adapt to people in a reasonable way. But in the field of affective computing, which is grounded in computer science primarily, you have people studying and building sociable robots. And these are robots that they believe people will want to live with. You know, whether they can do tasks for you or not is not as relevant as whether you want to be friends with them and you want to have their company and be with them. And if you think that's a little odd, then look into the social robotics literature and you'll see the kinds of things that they're doing there. They also want affective recognition that will support learning, so to keep motivation at a certain level so that students will continue to have a high enough interest level in order to continue learning. They want interfaces that adapt to people. And those have been tried, of course, and we're always trying to develop new ones. But most of the things that we have invented for people have been irritating rather than adaptive. Users have found that the adaptation is a little bit irritating and they don't really like it. Facial recognition, face animation, emotional speech synthesis, intelligent agents, virtual reality, those are all part of what people in affective computing are trying to build and trying to study. So the interest is to understand people more so that computers can become more like people. And after affective computing, then there was an offshoot of a subfield called affective HCI, which is human-computer interaction. And remember, in the early days, HCI wasn't called HCI. It was called man-machine learning or man-machine interaction. So it was a very system-based focus, and things have really changed. But really what affective HCI is doing is very similar to affective computing, is what they call symbiotic biocybernetic monitoring. They're monitoring with sensors attention, stress, and emotions during computer use. And this goes back to 1960 with Licklider's research. So it's not so new, but the more up-to-date review of affective HCI is in Hudlicka article 2003, which is in the list of references at the end. And that was actually a special topics issue on affective HCI, so there are many articles in there that have experiments dealing with this type of research. And then in 2008, the Lecture Notes in Computer Sciences, which is a huge journal in computer science. It doesn't sound like much, Lecture Notes in Computer Science, but it's huge. And we have it at our library in an electronic version. But Peter and Beal published this special topic issue in 2008 on affective HCI, and there's lots of interesting articles in there. And they focus on affect detection, emotion recognition, and these other kinds of things. Intelligent interruption, because we get interrupted constantly, but we want it to be an intelligent interruption. Personally, I haven't seen one. I've seen a lot of unintelligent interruptions and interferences and things that are hyping alerts, to make you feel like something is really wrong when it really isn't. And so those interruptions really tend to spike negative emotion rather than make you feel like they're helpful and giving you a break. It's usually, your files are being lost, they're going down the drain, you better stop what you're doing right now. Kind of an attitude in those interruptions that we typically get. They're also looking at task negotiation and scheduling to help people multitask, because we do multitask and we need more support for multitasking, because the more we multitask, the more distractible we get. We can easily go off in another direction, and that can cause a problem because we might forget what we were doing before that we do need to get back to finish. So we need support for multitasking, but it's a challenge to provide good support. And of course we want error assistance, error reduction, and prevention. And we've seen in the databases how they've evolved, and even Google itself, where when you type in your search string, it'll come back and say, did you mean? And it'll correct your typos and maybe correct your concept, and those kinds of things do help. So in affective HCI, I think the last one had the facial recognition too. A lot of affective HCI has been based on research done on facial recognition, and this started mid-20th century. And in the upper right, you can sort of see how they use imaging to determine, a computer can use imaging to match somebody's face to the disgust face. So my face, when I show disgust, should look very similar to his, and the computer will be able to image it by comparing. There are some people in affective HCI and cognitive science that have really been moving this field forward, and Donald Norman is one of them, and he's got a lot of publications. I've passed around Emotional Design book, which was came out, I think in 2008, or maybe it was 2005. It was after Picard's book, and it really pushed the field further because it integrated research from neuroscience and cognitive science. So he talks about the visceral, the behavioral, and the reflective levels of affect processing. So he was able to show that affective is not just one thing, but it really is pervasive in the way people understand things. So some of the results from some studies, just selected studies, show that highly motivated people respond more interactively and cope better with usability problems. So if motivation is considered a positive affect, you want to do something. So they're willing to cope with things. And I can say that that's true in what I notice with students, is that they aren't as bothered by things that change in interfaces. They accept it more as progress, as, okay, things are changing now and we're going to keep up with it. Whereas people like me who are digital immigrants are more likely to say, what? Another change? You mean I have to do it differently now? What happened? Why can't they just leave it the way it was? So you get these disparities in motivation and coping ability. And Creed and Beal found that emotionally engaged users were more likely to be affected than those who were less engaged. A study that I did, and I'm not going to go into details on these numbers, but just to show you that some of the affective variables that I've been looking at that are significant in search behavior, optimism is very important, and so is self-efficacy. So people who got higher scores on the skill, were able to do the task successfully, were more optimistic and believed in their ability more. That's the self-efficacy. But they also evaluated the database they were using more highly. They thought it was a good database more than the people who didn't do as well. And they also evaluated the results with higher relevance, and they were more satisfied overall. So these affective elements showed that they impact cognitive results too. So these up on the upper right, that's an animated avatar that's expressing emotions, and that's another way that they're trying to understand users, by having them use avatars to express feelings when using technology. So Norman, this is from his book, Emotional Design. Emotions are inseparable from a necessary part of cognition and must be addressed in design. Cognition is not a separate thing. It's not just understanding and knowing. You have to get the emotional aspects together. So adding emotional states to game characters made the game more engaging, and there's an example of emotional states being added to game characters in the upper right. And even in driving, because I continue to study driving, they are continuously trying to figure out ways to keep drivers awake, to keep them in a better mood so they won't start fights on the road and cause accidents and so forth. So that is all part of affective computing too. So along with Donald Norman and Herbert Simon and many others in this broad field, I've identified and described three human systems that interact. It's not just the affective system, but it's interacting with cognitive system and with the sensory motor system. And these are some of the elements that are involved in each system. These systems don't operate independently. They operate as interrelated systems, but they are also simultaneous. So they're not, you're not like feeling something one minute and thinking something the next. It's all integrated simultaneously. So it makes it more difficult to study. As a result of my work, I've really come to this conclusion that all information needs, information seeking, information use, information reception, is all processed through the emotional system. And all my data from all my studies show that. The diagrams on the right, the happy faces and the sad faces and the ill people and everything else that's there, show the kinds of things that can interfere with information use and information reception. So I can say that information behavior is directed by social communication practices, and it operates through biological procedures like affect, cognition, and sensory motor in interacting with technological devices. And here's a model that I've created in order to demonstrate that. So I would normally walk through the model and show how it relates to affective computing, but we're getting so close to the end of the 20 minutes that I'm going to go on. And just let you know that in our own field of library and information science, a number of researchers have been working on affect over the years. And in 2005, Heidi Julian in Canada published this article where they addressed the issue of affect in information behavior. And they found that it was still marginalized, but that's really rapidly changing and has changed since that year in 2005, because many things occurred that increased the research in that area. T.D. Wilson has done research on self-efficacy. I've done quite a bit of work on self-efficacy. Amanda Spink has studied uncertainty. I've looked at uncertainty quite a bit too. And I've defined something called affective load theory, because cognitive load theory has been around for quite a while, but it doesn't acknowledge the impact of affect. So I've done this in order to address that. And I have a formula. Affective load is equal to the felt uncertainty multiplied by time pressure, which is also felt. People in information problem-solving situations usually have a deadline, and they don't give themselves enough time. So time pressure becomes a factor that affects things. There's work in cognitive science that shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that positive affect really facilitates cognitive processes. And there's a whole new area called social emotional learning, or SEL, and that's becoming the new pedagogy. You must integrate affect into pedagogy. And of course, Carol Kofau pioneered research on the role of affect in the information search process. Some other information behavior researchers have found that social context is important, such as Katapol and, of course, Chapman. Her research is very important in documenting the emotional aspects of information use in specific populations. And several others have found these roles of affect in their studies. So context, situated use are very important, but also values that people have. So on these slides, the next 4 slides are the selected literature, and so I'm just going to page through briefly so that you get it on the recording, but we won't cover it, and it is selected. I mean, there's a lot here, but there's a lot more out there because it's a multidisciplinary world. So I think we should have some questions and comments now. If anybody would like to, I'm going to toggle back to the chat room. Feel free to speak if you wish. Chat lag. I guess we're having chat lag. Vivian, if you want to talk, you can do that too. Okay, Rita says she likes the distinction between HCI and computer science and the affective perspective. Thank you, Rita. I appreciate that comment very much because it wasn't apparent to me until I did some extensive literature reviews. And the article that I published in JSIST, I think 2007, has those literature reviews, so if anybody's interested in seeing that. Oh good, turn on your mic, that's a good idea. It's faster than typing, especially my typing. Oh good, thanks Rita, I appreciate that.
Any question about Rita?
Yeah, are UI software programs that do eye tracking?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see it. are UI software programs that do eye tracking integrating AC into their designs? Not necessarily, but eye tracking is one of the biometric types of methods that are used in affective computing. So I wouldn't say that everybody who uses eye tracking integrates the emotional aspect, but people who do affective computing research can use eye tracking, yes. Oh, no, we can't hear you, Vivian. Let's see, I've got my volume turned up pretty high. Yes, Rita has done eye tracking from computer science, and you didn't gather any affective or emotional data probably in that research, Rita, but you can. And I think the strongest type of data integrates the biometric with the user-based data in order to corroborate what's being found in the biometrics, because biometrics don't have content. They have, imaging, graphing, instances of, spiking things that's going on in the brain, and you can see blood flow changes and galvanic skin responses. But how do you pin that to actual content of a thought somebody's having, or a feeling that they're having, or a frustrating experience that they're having?
Quantify, basically.
You have to ask the person,
Yeah.
so that you can then identify, what the spike refers to. You know something's happening, but not necessarily the content. And that's why I have spent more time working from the user perspective than from the biometric perspective, but I value that as well. Yes. Does realism have an effect on affect? Ooh, that's good use of effect and affect. People often get those confused. Smileys versus 3D avatars. I can't answer that, Vivian. I think it would depend on what it is you're testing and what the situation people are in. If you're using avatars just for the sake of using avatars, probably not. But if people are in a virtual world environment, then it could make more sense to use the avatar metaphor instead of the smiley metaphor or other forms. It's really, we're still in the stage where people are trying out lots of things and trying to see what works. I've seen people use little widgets on the screen, for example, during searching experiments. One of my colleagues invented a frustrometer, and it was a little widget on the screen, and people could just click on the dial to say how frustrated they were, either at certain intervals or whenever they felt like it. So it's important to have, I think, in affective computing, multiple measures so that you're checking on how people are every few minutes or so, because their dynamic changes as they use the system. They can be up, they can be down. Oh, affective computing affecting artificial intelligence? Oh yes, definitely, yeah. Especially in the area of social robotics. And that's a really fascinating area to look into, how they're trying to make robots that will either help people or that will help people and be a companion, so to speak.
The AC research more or less, it informs the artificial intelligence progress.
That's a good point. Josh says that AC research can inform the progress of artificial intelligence. It's only been formally part of the literature for 12 years or so since Picard's book, but when you do literature reviews, you can see that this kind of research goes back, and that there's always been certain people who were interested in including it, but they were not prominent enough because of the cognitive revolution. Cognitive science really came on strong and took over, and everybody was really interested in focusing on it. So the affective aspects have been set aside relatively routinely over time. And I think now they're starting to become more prominent in the minds of researchers. Certainly in HCI, it's become a great interest, but they didn't start out being interested in that at all. Have I been able to test my algorithm, my formula, I guess, affective load formula based on the affective response versus the time pressure? I'm not quite sure what that means. I created the formula because in studying people, I discovered that time pressure was such a big factor in their behavior, in their decision to make a choice or move on or quit. So I included it as part of the formula. So I'm not quite sure what your question is asking, Rita. Okay. There's a lot to pursue in this domain. Very little has been done, even though a lot of research has gone on. It takes time because people are complex and they're not generic, and you can't build a one-size-fits-all interface or a one-size-fits-all technology. Now we've become very symbiotic with our technology, but we still need to understand more. Okay, thanks, Vivian. I don't think there are any more questions on our end either. Oh, thank you very much for letting us participate. Yes, we are too. We're very